I am not by any measure a man who notices things. That is what my father said of me, and what my tutors wrote in the margins of their reports, and what 3 consecutive headmasters at Harrow communicated to my family in increasingly polite letters. Edmund Frey, they all concluded in their varying vocabularies, is agreeable, comfortable, and almost entirely unobservant. They were not wrong. I have spent the better part of 41 years arranging my life for maximum ease and minimum attention. I read when it pleases me. I ride when the weather cooperates. I attend house parties when the invitations are sufficiently interesting and the cellars sufficiently well stocked, and I have successfully avoided, for the whole of my adult life, anything that might reasonably be described as consequence. So it is with some private astonishment that I find myself the sole witness to the most consequential thing I have ever seen. This is the account of how Callum Dre, the Duke of Ashverne, a man so controlled that I once watched him receive news of a flooded estate, a broken axle, and a ruined harvest in a single morning and respond to all 3 with a single raised eyebrow, was undone. Entirely, thoroughly, and permanently undone. Not by scandal, though scandal came. Not by ruin, though ruin threatened. But by a clergyman's daughter from Ashwick village, who corrected him on a point of estate law in front of 23 titled guests, and did not apologize for it. I should say at once, I was there for all of it, every word, every silence, every frost-covered morning and candle-lit evening at Wrenhellow Park that autumn, when the whole business unfolded with the slow, inexorable momentum of a very long novel no one had told me I was living inside. I can report it faithfully. I was paying attention for once in my life, because once it started I could not have looked away. Begin at the beginning, then. Begin at Wrenhellow. Wrenhellow Park sat in the shallow bowl of the Wiltshire hills like a man who had been rich for so long he had forgotten to wonder about it. The house was enormous and impeccably managed. The grounds ran to several hundred acres of parkland, a walled garden, 2 ornamental lakes, and a stone bridge over a stream that existed, as far as I could determine, primarily to be picturesque. Lady Hemsworth, who owned it all through an inheritance so old that no one thought to question it, opened Wrenhellow every October for what she called, with absolute placidity, a gathering of congenial people. What she meant was 30 guests, a fortnight's duration, and a program of shooting, riding, musicales, and drawing-room evenings designed to produce, by the end of the fortnight, at least 2 engagements and 1 renewed acquaintance that would later lead to useful parliamentary alliances. Lady Hemsworth was 74 years old and had been engineering October at Wrenhellow since before I was born. She was, by her own cheerful admission, very good at it. Callum had been attending since he inherited the dukedom at 26. I had been attending since Callum brought me along the first time, and Lady Hemsworth decided she liked me well enough to invite me back on my own merits, which consisted mainly of my ability to make her laugh at dinner and to lose gracefully at whist. I did not pretend to be useful. I was ornamental, and I filled my role without complaint. We arrived on the Tuesday, in the usual way, Callum's carriage, Callum's luggage, Callum's valet, and my borrowed use of him when my own man was unavailable. The house received us with the warmth reserved for frequent guests. Lady Hemsworth kissed my cheek and told me I looked thin, which I did not, and took Callum's hands in both of hers and told him he looked severe, which he did. "You always look as though you are arriving to audit someone's accounts," she told him. "He usually is," I said. Callum gave me the look he reserved for remarks of this kind, a level, gray-eyed look that communicated, without any alteration of expression, that he had noted the comment and found it approximately what he expected of me, and followed the butler inside. I stood in the entrance hall and looked around at the assembled party. The usual faces, Lord and Lady Danforth, who attended every year and spent the whole fortnight not speaking to each other with tremendous economy and elegance. Sir Bertram Lowe, who shot beautifully and said almost nothing worth hearing. Miss Annabel Crewe and her mother, who had been attending for 6 years in increasingly urgent hopes of Miss Crewe securing a titled attachment. Various others I knew in the comfortable, undemanding way of a man who has moved in the same circles for 20 years. And at the far end of the hall, standing beside the fireplace with a cup of tea and a copy of I Squinted, a very thick volume on property law, a young woman I did not recognize. She was not dressed for a house party. That is the first thing I noticed. The other women in the hall wore the soft afternoon gowns that Renhello's particular brand of country elegance required, muted silks, a few careful jewels, the artful appearance of ease. This woman wore a plain gray wool dress of the kind that communicated without apology that she was not here on the same errand as Miss Crewe and her mother. Her hair was very dark, arranged with the minimum of fuss. Her face was, I searched for the word and found it, slightly to my surprise, intent. She was reading with the focused attention of someone who expected the book to yield something useful. Edmund. I turned. Lady Hemsworth had reappeared at my elbow with the quiet efficiency she deployed when she had decided to tell you something. "Who is the young woman by the fireplace?" I asked. "Miss Cecily Vane," she said with some satisfaction. "Companion to my cousin Lady Ashwick, who was meant to come but has a head cold. Miss Vane came in her stead. She is a clergyman's daughter from Ashwick Village, very clever, reads everything, argues about half of it." Lady Hemsworth smiled in the way she smiled when she had placed a piece on a board. I thought it might be interesting. I looked at Miss Vane, who had not looked up from her book. I looked at Lady Hemsworth, who was watching me with a placid expression that covered considerable industry. "Interesting," I said. "Yes, I imagine it might be." The first collision happened that evening. Dinner was the usual Renhello production, 2 long tables, 9 courses, candles burning down into their silver holders, the slow accumulation of wine and wit that Lady Hemsworth had refined to an art form. I sat midway down the left table, between Lady Danforth and a pleasant baronet's wife, whose name I have since forgotten, and I ate my soup and watched the room with the pleasant vagueness that served me well at these occasions. Callum sat at the head of the right table, as rank required. He was engaged in conversation with Sir Bertram Lowe about the proposed alteration to the county boundary, a parliamentary matter of some dryness, but one that affected several of the estates in the room, and he was doing what he always did in these conversations, making very precise, very measured points, one after another, with the calm certainty of a man who has never in his life been factually wrong about anything and has no particular expectation of starting now. "The matter is settled by the Ashverne Enclosure Act of 1842, Callum said, in the tone he used for settled matters. "The eastern boundary passes 3 furlongs south of the Hartwell stream. There is no ambiguity." A silence of the particular quality that falls when a duke has spoken. Then from the other end of the table, a voice, pleasant, unhurried, absolutely unperturbed. "The 1842 Act was superseded by the Boundary Clarification Order of 1861, Your Grace. The eastern line now runs from the 2nd marker post, not the 3rd. The difference is roughly 40 acres. Every head in the room turned. Miss Cecily Vane was looking at Callum with the tranquil directness of a woman who has looked up a fact, confirmed it, and is simply reporting it. She was not combative. She was not nervous. She was, as far as I could determine, mildly interested to see what he would do with the information. Callum looked at her for a very long moment. In 21 years of friendship, I had never seen anyone correct Callum on a factual matter in company. Several people had tried. None had been right. Callum had a memory like a surveyor's instrument, calibrated, precise, slightly inhuman in its reliability. The possibility that he had been wrong, in front of 23 guests, about a point of county boundary law he had cited with the confidence of a man citing the time of day, I watched him absorb it. I watched something very small and very interesting happen behind his gray eyes. "The 1861 order," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." You are certain? It was not a challenge. Or rather it was, but it was the challenge of a man who genuinely wanted to know whether she was certain, not the challenge of a man who expected her to fold. Quite certain, she said. I read the original order last month. Lady Ashwick has an interest in the Hartwell boundary. It is 42 acres, actually, on the corrected survey. The 40 acres was the approximation. Another silence, longer. Then Callum said, "Thank you, Miss Vane," and turned back to Sir Bertram Lowe and said, "It appears I require a correction," and proceeded to restate his position with the revised figure, with the equanimity of a man to whom accuracy was always more important than being seen to be right. I looked at Miss Vane. She had returned to her soup. She was not triumphant. She was not watching to see how it had landed. She had reported a fact, the fact had been received, and she had moved on. She lifted her spoon with the serenity of a woman who had never once in her life performed for a room. I found, to my considerable surprise, that I was holding my breath. The days that followed had a particular quality I had not previously encountered at Wrenhello. Callum found reasons to be in whatever room Miss Vane was in. He did not do this obviously. Callum did nothing obviously, but I was paying attention, for once, and I noticed. If Miss Vane was in the library, Callum developed a sudden requirement for a particular volume. If she was in the morning room writing letters for Lady Hemsworth, Callum appeared with estate papers that needed the desk by the window. If she walked out to the walled garden after luncheon, Callum, 3 minutes later, discovered a desire for fresh air. What he did, once he was in the room, was argue with her. Not unpleasantly. Not in the way that rank argued with lesser persons. That particular performance of barely tolerant superiority I had watched titled men deploy against clever women for 30 years. Callum argued with Miss Vane the way he argued with the 3 men in England he actually respected. Head-on, without condescension, as though her position was worth dismantling rather than dismissing. And Miss Vane argued back in kind. I witnessed the library exchange on the Thursday. Callum had produced a copy of Blackstone's commentaries, and was, I gathered, attempting to demonstrate that her reading of the 1861 order was technically valid, but practically inapplicable in the case of unregistered boundary markers. Miss Vane had the relevant statute open on the table in front of her, and was demonstrating, with the patient clarity of a very good teacher, exactly why he was wrong. The marker posts are referenced in the original 1842 survey, Callum said. If the posts themselves are in dispute, the 1861 order defaults to the original coordinates. The posts are not in dispute, Miss Vane said. The posts exist. They are simply not the second post and the third post as originally numbered. They were renumbered in 1853 when the eastern hedge was replanted. The 1861 order cites the renumbered sequence. This is recorded in the county land registry. I can give you the volume and page reference if you'd like. A pause. You have the county land registry reference memorized, Callum said. I read it 3 weeks ago, she said. I have a reasonable memory. A reasonable memory, he repeated, and something moved in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, and was, in any case, the most animated I had seen his face in several years. Miss Vane, I have been engaged in parliamentary business involving county boundary law for 11 years. I have read, I believe, most of the relevant documents. I have not previously encountered anyone who was right, she offered mildly. The thing in his expression deepened. I was going to say, who had read the county land registry for leisure. It was for Lady Ashwick's interest, she said, not leisure. Though I confess, I did find it interesting. Of course you did, he said, and sat down in the chair across from her, and opened the Blackstone to the relevant page and said, "Show me the 1853 reference." She showed him. He read it. He was silent for a moment in the way Callum was silent when he was genuinely thinking, which was different from the way he was silent when he was merely waiting for someone to finish speaking. Then he said, "You're right." "I know," she said, and turned the page. I was sitting in the corner with a novel I had entirely stopped reading. I looked down at the page. I looked up at the two of them, bent over the land registry together, and I thought, well, this is new. By the end of the first week, the whole house party had noticed. This was inevitable. The drawn rooms of a country house fortnight are the finest instruments of observation ever devised. Nothing escapes them. The noticing took various forms. Miss Crewe's mother noticed with anxiety and communicated it to Miss Crewe, who received it with the resigned understanding of a young woman who had spent 6 Octobers at Wrenhallow and had made her peace with the geometry of these situations. Lady Hemsworth noticed with satisfaction and said nothing, which was her most eloquent communication. Sir Bertram Lowe noticed and said, over the port on Friday evening, in the comfortable directness of a man who had known Callum for 15 years, "Never seen you listen to anyone like that, Ashverne. She correct you again today." On the matter of the 1853 renumbering, yes, Callum said. And she was right again, Callum said, without the smallest indication of embarrassment, which was one of the things I had always genuinely admired about him. I noticed with a combination of amusement and something else, something quieter, that I was still in the process of identifying. I noticed the way she answered him, never with deference, never with the careful softening that clever women in drawing rooms deployed around powerful men. She answered him as though rank were simply not a relevant variable, not rudely, not with the self-conscious defiance of someone performing independence. Simply, as one person to another, where the only thing that mattered was whether you had read the document and whether your reading of it was correct. And I noticed the way he listened. Callum Dre listened to almost no one. He was patient in the way that very certain people were patient. He allowed you your point. He heard it with perfect courtesy, and he proceeded with his own view unaltered. With Miss Vane he listened, and then he sometimes altered his view. Once, on Saturday afternoon in the drawing-room, in the middle of a debate about the proposed new Poor Law amendments, I watched him change his position entirely over the course of 12 minutes, and then argue the new position with the same confidence he had brought to the old one. Miss Vane watched this without visible satisfaction and simply said, "Yes, that seems right," and moved on to the next point. "You do not find it strange," I said to her later, when we happened to be walking the same stretch of gravel path by the ornamental lake, "that the Duke of Ashverne defers to you on points of law?" She considered this with genuine interest. Does he defer to me? I had not thought of it that way. We are reading the same documents and reaching the same conclusions when the documents are clear. When he is right, I say so. He is right less often than he expects, in your company. He is right most of the time, she said, with a precision that struck me as characteristic. He is very well informed. He has simply not read the 1853 county records. Miss Vane, I said, I have been friends with the Duke of Ashverne for 21 years. He has not previously been in the habit of talking to anyone as he talks to you. She looked at me with clear, direct eyes, not sharp, not guarded, simply attentive. How does he talk to me? As though he is interested in what you are going to say next, I said. It is, in my experience of him, unprecedented. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a kind thing to tell me, Mr. Frey, but I am Lady Ashwick's companion. I am here in her place for a fortnight. I think you and I both know the relevant facts of the situation." She said it without bitterness, without self-pity. As a simple accounting of the facts, in the same register she might have offered the county land registry reference. I looked at her. I thought, you have read every document in the room, and you have read this one correctly, and you are wrong anyway. But I did not say so. It was not mine to say. The secret arrived on the Wednesday of the second week. I tell this part carefully, because it is the part where everything that had been accumulating, the arguments, the silences, the slow, unmistakable drawn together of two people who moved through the world in fundamentally incompatible orbits, came up against the thing that Callum had carried for 11 years and never set down. The letter arrived in the Morning Post. I know this because Callum sent for me after he had read it, which was itself unusual enough to constitute an alarm. He did not, as a rule, send for anyone. I found him in the small writing room off the east corridor, standing at the window with the letter in his hand. "Sit down, Edmund," he said. I sat. He turned from the window. "There is a man named Ashford Greer," he said. "He was a solicitor in Bath 11 years ago. He is now dead. His son has inherited his papers." He held the letter up. "His son has found a letter I wrote to his father in 1873, when I had just inherited the dukedom, and the estate was carrying debts that would have ruined it within 3 years." He set the letter down. He sat in the chair opposite me. He folded his hands on the desk in the deliberate way. He folded his hands when he was maintaining a position by will rather than ease. "In 1873, he said, "I had a choice. The estate could have been saved through an alliance with a railway company that was, as I have since confirmed in every possible particular, entirely legitimate in its operations. Or it could have been saved through a single decision. I was asked to use my position on the County Land Committee to certify a boundary survey that I knew, having read the actual survey documents, was incorrect. The certification would have cleared the way for a land sale that benefited a consortium of investors. I would receive a payment for the certification. It was not legal. I knew it was not legal. I was 26 years old, and the estate employed 400 people." He stopped. I looked at him. "You certified the survey," I said. "Yes," he said. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was walking on the gravel, the crunch of footsteps unhurried. "The consortium dissolved 3 years later," he said. "The land sale was completed. No one was harmed as far as I have ever been able to determine. The incorrect boundary benefited a consortium of men who were already wealthy and affected no tenant farmers or landholders in any material way. I have spent 11 years telling myself these things, and they are all true, and none of them is the point." "The point," I said slowly, "is that you knew the survey was incorrect and you certified it anyway." "Yes." "For money." "For the estate," he said, "which is a distinction I make less and less convincingly as time passes." He looked at his hands. "Greer Jr. has found the letter. He is not threatening blackmail. The letter merely makes clear that his father acted on my instruction, and my instruction was unlawful. He is writing to inform me that the papers will be included in a memoir his father was preparing, which he intends to have published." "Can you stop the publication?" "Perhaps, through legal means probably. Through other means, certainly." His voice was entirely flat. "I have spent this morning considering which of those means I am willing to use." I looked at him for a long time. "And," I said, "and I find I am not willing to use any of them," he said, "which presents me with a problem." He picked up the letter again. He looked at it. And then he said, very quietly, the thing that made me understand what this conversation was actually about. "She will hear of it." I did not need to ask who he meant. "Yes," I said, "she likely will." He set the letter down. "She told me on Monday evening, did you hear it? We were talking about the Parliamentary Committee on Land Registration, and she said," he stopped. He pressed his fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose. "She said that the one thing she could not respect in a man of public responsibility was the willingness to let private interest override public duty. She said it the way she says everything, without heat, without performance, as a simple statement of what she believed." "I know," I said, "I was there." "She was talking about a hypothetical," he said, "a newspaper case, something in last week's Times. I know that too. He was quiet. Callum, I said. I used his given name rarely enough that it served as a kind of punctuation. What are you going to do? He stood up. He went back to the window. He stood there with his hands behind his back and looked out at the frost-pale garden for a long time. I don't know, he said. That is the first time I have said that about anything in 11 years. What happened next, I did not witness directly. I assembled it afterward from the parts I saw and the parts that were told to me, and I give it here as faithfully as I can. That afternoon, Miss Vane was in the library. Not for leisure, she was writing a letter on Lady Ashwick's behalf regarding the Hartwell boundary, incorporating the county land registry references she had cited over the previous week. The door was open. Callum came in. I do not know exactly what was said in the first few minutes, because I was not there. What I know is that Lady Danforth, passing the library door, heard enough to stop her in the corridor, and what she told me later in the careful, slightly stunned way of a woman who had just witnessed something she had not expected was this. The Duke of Ashverne had come into the library and told Miss Vane about the letter. All of it, the survey of 1873, the certification, the payment, the 11 years of telling himself it was not as bad as it was. He did not present it to her as a managed account. He did not edit the facts. He told her in the same flat, precise way he told me, without the armor of excuse or the performance of remorse, as a statement of what he had done. And Miss Vane had listened. And then she had said, quietly and without cruelty, I see. And then she had gone back to her letter. Lady Danforth said she stood in the corridor for another full minute and did not hear another word spoken in the library. And then she moved on because she was not, after all, a woman who listened at doors. What I do know, because I was present for it, is what happened that evening. I found Miss Vane in the east sitting room at 6:30, standing at the window with her hands folded in front of her, watching the frost settle on the garden. She had not come to the afternoon gathering in the blue drawing-room. She had not sent any word. Miss Vane, I said. She turned. Her face was composed. This was the word I kept reaching for and kept finding, composed, not cold. Not performing composure. Simply, settled in herself, the way she was always settled, even when the thing she had settled in herself was something difficult. Mr. Frey, she said, you know, I suppose. He told me this morning, I said. She nodded. She turned back to the window. I have been trying to decide, she said, what I actually think. And I think it was wrong, she said, plainly and without qualification. He knew it was wrong when he did it, and he did it anyway, and he has spent 11 years constructing reasons why it was less wrong than it was. That is the truth of it. Yes, I said, that is the truth of it. And I think, she said more slowly, that he told me because he could not tell me, which is also the truth of something. I waited. I do not know what to do with a person who is both of those things at once, she said. I was not prepared for it. No, I said, I don't imagine you were. She was quiet for a moment. The frost on the garden was very fine, very white, very still. I am going to leave in the morning, she said. Not in anger, not to punish him, but because I need to think somewhere that is not this house, and I cannot think here with him in it. I understand, I said. She looked at me. Do you think I am being unkind? I think, I said carefully, that you are being exactly what you always are, which is honest. She nodded once. Then, will you tell him or shall I? I think you should, I said, but I will be present if you'd like. She shook her head. No, thank you, Mr. Frey. This is something that wants to be said without an audience. I learned what happened in the frost garden from Callum himself in the small hours of the night, when he appeared at the door of my room and knocked. He was dressed. He had clearly not slept. He sat in the chair by my fireplace and stared at the embers for a long time before he spoke. She came to find me, he said, in the garden after dinner. He stopped. She said she was leaving in the morning. She said it quietly, the way she says everything. She said she bore me no ill will and she hoped I would be well, and she said he pressed his hand briefly to his face. She said she hoped I would not try to suppress the memoir. She said that if I was the man she thought I was becoming, I would let it be printed and stand in front of it. I sat up in my bed and looked at him. She said that, I said. Yes. Not to wound you. No, he said, not to wound me. She said it the way she says everything that matters, as if she meant it to be useful. He looked at his hands, and then she said good night and went inside. The fire was very low. The room was very quiet. And did you, I began. I stood in the garden for a long time, he said, and then I came up here. I looked at him. Callum Dre, the Duke of Ashverne, the most controlled man I had ever known, sitting in my fireplace chair in the middle of the night with his hands open in his lap and his face, for the first time in 21 years of friendship, entirely, completely unguarded. She told you what to do, I said. Yes. And you are going to do it. He looked at the embers for a very long time. Then, I don't know how to want something this much, he said. I have never done it before. I know, I said. It is a very inconvenient experience. I imagine so. Edmund, he looked up. What do I do? I thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. I was not, as I have established, a man who was accustomed to being asked for advice of consequence. But I had been paying attention for nearly 2 full weeks, and I had been paying attention for 21 years before that, and I knew what I had seen. You do what she said, I said. You let the memoir be published. You stand in front of it. You don't try to manage it or contain it or present it in the least damaging light. You stand in front of it as it is. I paused. And then you go and find her. He was quiet. Not to ask her to forgive you the thing you did in 1873, I said. That is between you and God and the County Land Committee. But to ask her whether she might like to know the man you are now, without the 11 years of excuses, without the performance of being a duke who has never made a mistake in his life. He looked at me for a long moment. You are considerably less useless than you appear, he said. I am aware of that, I said. I have kept it quiet. The morning was cold and very clear. I was at my window when I saw Miss Vane's trunk being loaded onto the Ashwick carrier's cart. She stood beside it in her plain gray wool coat, speaking quietly to Lady Hemsworth, who had come out in a great wrap, and was holding both of Miss Vane's hands in hers with the expression of a woman who had placed a piece on a board, and watched it move exactly as she had intended. Callum was not in the hall to see her off. I looked for him and could not find him, and then I stopped looking because I understood. He was in the writing room. I did not go in. But an hour later, when I passed in the corridor, I heard him dictating to his secretary, and the secretary's pen was moving very quickly, and I went on without stopping. What happened next took 3 weeks and unfolded in 3 movements, and I know all 3 because I was, by this point, too thoroughly interested to remove myself to the comfortable distance I preferred. The first movement was the letter he wrote to Greer Jr., not a legal letter, not a managed communication from a duke to a solicitor about the containment of embarrassing papers. A plain letter, the kind that could only have been written by someone who had stopped calculating the consequences and simply written the truth. He told me what was in it. He told Greer Jr. that his father's account of the 1873 certification was accurate. He told him that he would not oppose the publication. He told him that he was sorry to Greer Jr., to Greer Sr.'s memory, to whoever else it concerned, and that the sorry was not the managed variety but the kind that did not ask anything in return. The second movement was the conversation he had, 1 week after Renhullo ended, with the Secretary of State for Counties, in which he tendered his resignation from the County Land Committee. He had served on it for 9 years. He gave as his reason the 1873 certification. The Secretary of State was, by all accounts, speechless for a full 4 seconds, which in political terms is an eternity. He then attempted to dissuade Callum. Callum declined to be dissuaded. "You did not have to go that far," I told him when he told me. "I know," he said. "It will cost you the county council appointment, the cabinet position that Harcroft was proposing." "I know." "Callum." "Edmund," he said patiently. "She said to stand in front of it. She did not say to stand in front of the comfortable parts." I opened my mouth. I closed it. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I see," I said. "You are taking the advice literally." "I am taking the advice seriously," he said, "which is what she would do." The third movement was the visit to Ashwick Village. He did not write first. He told me this when he told me he was going, and I asked why not, and he said, "Because a letter can be composed. Because a letter is a managed thing." He wanted to arrive without preparation, without performance, without the armor of a well-crafted sentence between himself and whatever she said when she saw him. I offered to come. He declined. I was, I confess, slightly relieved because there are limits to how much even a reformed observer wants to intrude upon. He drove himself in a plain, hired carriage. He arrived at the vicarage on a Tuesday morning in November when the sky was the particular flat gray of the English countryside in late autumn, and the village of Ashwick was going about its Tuesday business, with the comfortable indifference of a place that had no reason to be interested in a duke arriving in a hired carriage. He knocked on the vicarage door. He told me what happened in the vicarage parlor that afternoon. She opened the door herself. No maid, no intermediary, simply Miss Vane in a different plain dress, her hair somewhat less arranged than it had been at Wrenhallow, and a book under her arm. She looked at him for a moment with those clear, direct eyes. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vane," he said, "I have come to say something, and I would rather say it here than in a letter." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The parlor was small and very warm and contained 3 full bookcases, a writing desk covered in papers, and a gray cat that regarded him with magnificent disdain. He sat in the chair she indicated. She sat opposite him. She did not offer tea, not from rudeness, he said, but because she was the sort of person who did not fill up silences with performance, and tea in the first 5 minutes of this particular visit would have been performance. "I have resigned from the County Land Committee," he said. "I heard," she said. "The Ashwick Times carried a brief notice. Your father-in-law, your father, I beg your pardon, will be displeased." "He is," Callum said. "He told me so at some length." "And the cabinet appointment?" "Gone," he said. "Harcroft will not touch me now." She looked at him steadily. "I did not ask you to do those things," she said. "No," he said. "You told me to stand in front of it. I decided for myself how far to stand." A long pause. The fire in the parlor grate spoke softly. The gray cat left its chair and crossed the room, and sat on the hearth with the satisfied air of an animal that has decided the newcomer was acceptable. "Why are you here?" she said, not coldly, with the same directness she brought to every question that mattered. He looked at her, and Callum Dray, the Duke of Ashverne, who had, in 21 years of my observation, never been at a loss for the precise and calibrated word, said, "Because I do not know how to conduct myself when I am not in the same room as you. I have tried for 3 weeks, and I find it is beyond me." He paused. "And because I wanted you to meet, not the Duke of Ashverne with his Parliament and his committees and his 11 years of justification. I would like, if you are willing, to introduce you to a somewhat less impressive person. He is 41 years old. He made a serious mistake at 26 and has spent too long managing it rather than reckoning with it. He reads everything, argues about most of it, and has recently discovered that the only opinion he actually cares about is yours. He has no cabinet position, has just resigned from the only county committee that would have him, and is sitting in a vicarage parlor in Ashwick on a Tuesday in November because he could not think of anywhere else in England he actually wanted to be. The fire, the cat, the flat gray November light through the parlor window. Miss Cecily Vane looked at him for a very long time. She had the quality, I had noticed it across an entire fortnight, of looking at things as they were, rather than as they might conveniently be, and of sitting with the difficulty of that for exactly as long as it took. Then she said, "You have still read the wrong edition of Blackstone." He blinked. "The 4th edition," she said, "the one you had at Wrenhallow. The county land statute notes in the 4th edition are incomplete. You want the 5th. I have a copy." She stood and went to one of the bookcases and ran her finger along the spines and extracted a volume and came back and set it in his lap. "You can read it while I make tea," she said. "I find it is better to have something to do in difficult situations." He looked down at the volume of Blackstone in his lap. Then he looked up at her. "Miss Vane," he said. "Yes." "Is that are you saying?" "I am saying," she said, with the precise patience of a woman who had decided something and was informing him of the decision, "that you may stay for tea, and that we may see what comes after that." She paused at the parlor door. "I am not a forgiving person by habit, Your Grace, but I am a fair one. I think you have done what was hard. I think I would like to know what you are when no one is expecting you to be anything." A pause. "Tea," she said, "and then we will see." She went out. He sat in the small, warm parlor with the gray cat and the 5th edition of Blackstone and the plain November light, and I am told, he told me this later, with the expression of a man who was still slightly astonished by it. He felt, for the first time in 11 years, something that was not quite ease but was its first cousin. I was not present for the following 2 months. This was appropriate. There are parts of a story that do not want a witness, and what happened between Callum Dray and Miss Cecily Vane in the weeks after that Tuesday in Ashwick was properly theirs. What I know is assembled from letters, and one long evening in early January when Callum came to my rooms for dinner, and we talked until the fire burned down to ash. He had gone back to Ashwick the following week, and the week after that. He had met the Reverend Mr. Vane, who was a small, precise man with the same clear eyes as his daughter and a sharp intelligence he exercised primarily in the direction of his garden and his sermons. He had sat in the vicarage parlor arguing with Miss Vane about the Poor Law amendments, and the new land registration proposal, and the 3rd volume of a natural history she had been reading, and which she considered indispensable, and he considered overlong. He had walked with her in the village on the 2 occasions when the weather permitted. He had been introduced to the gray cat, whose name was Bentham, and who eventually consented to sit on his coat. "She argues," he told me in January, with a satisfaction so uncharacteristic that it took me a moment to recognize it. "I know," I said. "About everything. She has opinions about the county boundary law and the new railway proposals, and the 3rd Earl of Wentmore's handling of his estate, and the theological implications of the 3rd chapter of the Book of Job. Yesterday, she told me, I was reading the land registration pamphlet upside down. I was not reading it upside down, but she made the remark with such perfect serenity that I checked. "Were you upside down?" "No, but I checked." I smiled at my wine glass. "Edmund," he said. "Yes." "I am going to ask her to marry me." I set my glass down. I looked at him. "On what grounds?" I said. "You have no cabinet appointment. Your political prospects are considerably reduced. You are a duke with a resigned committee seat and a published memoir that has made you temporarily notorious and permanently honest. What precisely are you offering?" He looked at me with the level, gray-eyed look that meant he had heard the comment and knew exactly what I was doing. "Wrenhallow," he said, "which she will never see because it is not mine, the Ashverne estate, which is solvent and well-managed and employs 400 people and has a library that contains, among other things, the complete 5th edition of Blackstone and every volume of the county land registry for the past 30 years. He paused. And myself, such as I am. Such as you are, I said. Which is, he said, rather less than I appeared to be in October, and somewhat more than I appeared to be in 1873, and on the whole, I think, a reasonable proposition for a woman who has stated clearly that she prefers honest accounting to impressive performance. I thought about this. She is a clergyman's daughter, I said. She has no title, no fortune, no family connection that would recommend her to anyone in your world. The county will talk. I am aware of that. Your mother will be horrified. She already is. I wrote to her last week. I sat back. I looked at him for a long time. I thought of Miss Cecily Vane in the library at Wrenhello with the county land registry open in front of her, stating facts without performance and expecting nothing from the room. I thought of her in the Frost Garden, saying, I hope you will not try to suppress the memoir. I thought of her in the vicarage parlor, setting a volume of Blackstone in his lap and going to put the kettle on. She will say yes, I said. He raised his eyebrows slightly. You are confident. I am paying attention, I said. It is a recent development. I find I am rather good at it. He asked her in the vicarage garden on a Thursday morning in January, when the ground was iron-hard with frost, and the bare branches of the apple trees were white against a pale sky. And Bentham, the cat, was sitting on the garden wall, watching with the philosophical detachment of an animal for whom human decisions were an agreeable spectacle, but not a matter of personal urgency. He did not kneel, the ground was frozen, and he was 41 and practical. He stood in front of her and said what he had come to say, that he was not the man she had first heard cited incorrectly at Wrenhello, and he was not the man who had certified a fraudulent survey in 1873, and he was not the Duke of Ashverne who required an ornamental duchess to complete the arrangement of his public life. He was a man of 41 who had read the wrong edition of Blackstone, who had a gray cat's permanent approval, and a library that needed a better cataloging system, who had been wrong about the 1861 boundary order, and about a great number of other things, and who would very much like, if she was willing, to spend the rest of his life arguing with her about all of it. She looked at him for the full, considered moment she gave to all things that mattered. Then she said, yes. Not with tears, not with ceremony, with the quiet, direct certainty of a woman who had thought it through and reached a conclusion and was stating it plainly. The Blackstone, she added, 5th edition. I have already ordered 3 copies, he said. Good, she said. I have opinions about the annotation in volume 4. I know, he said. I am looking forward to hearing them. The apple trees, the frost, the January light, Bentham on the wall, having rendered judgment and found the proceedings satisfactory. The wedding was in March. The church at Ashwick, not the cathedral at Ashverne. Miss Vane, now to become the Duchess of Ashverne, made this clear with the cheerful firmness she brought to all decisions that were actually hers to make. The Reverend Mr. Vane officiated, which was either a beautiful piece of symmetry or an act of considerable nerve, depending on your view of ecclesiastical protocol, and which Miss Vane said was simply the most sensible arrangement, and she did not understand why anyone would find it otherwise. I stood beside Callum. His mother sat in the 3rd pew with the expression of a woman who had come to terms, over the preceding 2 months, with a great deal, and whose coming to terms had been assisted considerably by a long afternoon in the Ashverne library, during which Miss Vane had discussed the Ashverne estate management, with a thoroughness and intelligence that had, according to Callum, entirely reversed his mother's objections without either of them mentioning the reversal. Lady Hemsworth sat in the 5th pew with the satisfied expression of a woman who had placed a piece on a board in October and watched it arrive, in March, exactly where she had intended. The church was small and cold, and lit with morning light through old glass that threw pale patterns on the stone floor. Miss Vane came down the aisle on her father's arm in a plain ivory gown that was exactly what you would expect of a woman who did not perform for rooms, and she looked— I am not a sentimental man, but I was paying attention. She looked like herself, which was the finest thing she could have looked. Callum watched her come down the aisle. I have known him for 21 years. I have watched him receive disaster with a raised eyebrow and success with a measured nod. I have watched him in Parliament and in the hunting field, and at the country house parties of the English aristocracy, and at the worst moment of his life in a writing room at Wrenhello Park. I have never, in all of that time, seen his face do what it did when Cecily Vane walked toward him through the pale March light of Ashwick Church. He was completely without armor, entirely, helplessly, entirely himself. She reached him. She looked up at him with those clear, direct eyes. "You checked the register of banns twice," she said, very quietly as her father stepped back. "I wanted to be certain the date was correct," he said. "It was correct." "I know that now," he said. "You are going to be a great deal of work," she said, with the warmth she kept quiet and gave only when she meant it entirely. "I know that too," he said. The Reverend Mr. Vane, who had heard all of this, and whose expression communicated the serene amusement of a man who had watched his daughter's mind at work for 26 years, and was entirely unsurprised by how she employed it, said, "Shall we begin?" They married in the pale March light, in the plain stone church in Ashwick Village, and it was the truest thing I ever witnessed. I am not a man who notices things, except, it seems, when something worth noticing comes along, and I have found in the 18 months since Wrenhello and the Frost Garden and the Vicarage Parlour and the January morning in the apple orchard, that I notice considerably more than I used to. I notice, for instance, the way she moves through the Ashverne estate, through the rooms she now manages as naturally as she moved through the Wrenhello library, with that same quality of attention, of interest, of purpose. I notice the way the staff speak of her, with the particular warmth that people reserve for someone who has treated them as though their work matters, because she believes that it does. I notice the way he watches her, still, when she doesn't know he's looking, the way he crosses rooms to be near her without appearing to intend it, the way he defers to her opinions, not out of adoration, not out of the performance of a devoted husband, but because he has understood at 41 that the correct opinion is the one that has read all the documents and thought about them carefully, and that in this partnership, that will sometimes be his and sometimes be hers, and that this arrangement is, in fact, the most sensible possible arrangement. I notice the way she corrects him still, pleasantly, without ceremony, on points of estate law and parliamentary procedure, and the annotation in the 4th volume of Blackstone, and the cataloging system of the Ashverne Library, which she has reorganized twice since March to a system she finds more logical and which he has not, on either occasion, contested, because she explained her reasoning and her reasoning was sound. I was there for dinner at Ashverne last month. After dinner, they were in the library together, she reading, he working through a correspondence, and I sat by the fire with my port and watched them not watching each other and watched the small, habitual attentions. The cup of tea she set at his elbow without being asked, the lamp he moved when the light shifted, the way they occupied the room together with the ease of two people who have found the person they were made to argue with and have made of that argument a home. He looked up at one point and caught me watching. He gave me the look, the level, gray-eyed look. "You are paying attention," he said. "I am," I said. "I find I have acquired the habit." She looked up from her book. She looked between the two of us with the calm of a woman who had decided, long ago, not to be flustered by men's opaque exchanges. "The 4th volume of Blackstone," she said, without preamble, "has an error in the footnote to section 47. "I know," Callum said. "You told me on Tuesday. I was making sure you remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said. He said it without flourish, as a simple statement of fact in the same register she used for the county land registry. She looked at him for a moment with those clear, direct eyes. "I know," she said, and returned to her book. The fire burned. The library was warm and full of the particular quiet of two people who have nothing to perform for each other. I drank my port and said nothing, and was, for perhaps the first time in my life, exactly where I most wanted to be. That is the story of how the Duke of Ashverne was undone. It happened in the end, the way all the most consequential things happen. Not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of arguments and silences and frost mornings and honest accountings, until one day the most controlled man in England looked up from his correspondence in his own library and found that the whole careful architecture of his public life was beside the point entirely, and the only thing that mattered was the woman who had never once performed for him, and who, in not performing, had become the truest thing he had ever known. He did not recover. He did not, to my observation, particularly wish to.